We continue our study of the prophets by looking at the great prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel's the prophet who saw the millennial kingdom. He saw all the way through his prophecy, through the first coming of Jesus to the second coming of Jesus, and even beyond that time, and shares with us profound specifics about the millennial kingdom in Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48. The name Ezekiel means God hardens or God strengthens. I don't know if you realize this, but it was a tough job being a prophet in those days, because you had to bring all these messages of judgment and sin sermons of the people, and they don't necessarily want to hear all that. And even the kings who were in charge didn't want to hear all that. So he had to be strengthened, hardened for this task he would do for God in bringing God's message to those Jewish people. His wife died during the course of his ministry, and that was a very sad thing. Theology of Ezekiel, if I think of it theologically, we're revealing God who through his glory acts in both judgment and mercy toward his chosen people. In fact, once we've covered all the prophets in this course, we'll find out that virtually every prophet, except for a couple, prophesy judgment or discipline coming before restoration or salvation. It always seems like there's the judgment, there's the sin sermon, then nations are judged, Israel's judged. Later on, Messiah comes and they receive their salvation. But God's glory is a profound theme in this book. In chapter 9, verse 3, his glory is seen at the threshold of the temple. In chapter 10, then, his glory is seen at the Holy of Holies. So it's like, there's God, he's at the temple, and now we see God in the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant is. Then in chapter 11, we see the glory of God, the shining light of God, over on the east side of Jerusalem by the Mount of Olives, as if God is leaving the city and leaving the temple, and now he's going to be going. And he does go. Why is he going? Because Nebuchadnezzar is coming and he's going to destroy the city. And then at the very end, toward the end of the book in chapter 43, we see the glory of God indwelling this temple, this amazing millennial temple, this big structure that's a mile square on each side in the millennium. Ezekiel's kind of like Jeremiah in that he did symbolic acts. Remember Jeremiah had the linen belt and he had the big jug, poured poured all the water out, and then he had the ox yoke on his neck at the meeting. Well, Ezekiel does a lot of the same stuff. At the beginning, he eats the scroll. God says, here, take this little document and eat it. And he ate this document, and it was bitter and sweet. But it was mainly sweet to his taste because it was the Word of God. And the lesson there is the need to assimilate the Word of God. We need to digest, devour God's Word so that we can share His Word with others, like Ezekiel did. Then he did a parable of a brick. He's telling him Nebuchadnezzar is coming, just like Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar is coming. And he took this little stone and he built a little city on it and built up little army men attacking siege ramps. And he basically is giving this as an object lesson to the people. There's going to be a big, long war. He's going to lay on his side for 390 days. Ezekiel's going to spend most of his day out front of his house laying on his side. People are going to go, what are you doing, Ezekiel? That's strange. And he says, well, I'm on my side for 390 days, and that's for each day of that Israel needs to be punished for her sins. And that's going to be the captivity that's coming. Then Ezekiel's going out to lunch, and this is real stuff. He's really living this. He's got a plate, but it's not full of food. He doesn't have much food at all that he's eating. People are saying, Ezekiel, why aren't you eating much? He said, well, this indicates exilic starvation. We're going to be surrounded by Nebuchadnezzar, and you're not going to have much food to eat. We're going to be starving when Nebi comes. Then he's going to cut his hair, and it indicates great loss of life. He's got all this hair. He cuts it off. Ezekiel, why'd you get your hair cut? Well, I've lost a lot of hair. We're going to lose a lot of life when Nebuchadnezzar comes and destroys this place. Then he does a baggage skit, and he does a trembling skit. I mean, this is really something. This guy really knew how to preach. He's eating his ration food, and then he's shaking. He's visibly trembling and shaking while he eats and drinks. They go, why are you shaking, Ezekiel? It indicates the fear that's coming when Nebuchadnezzar comes along the way. Well, he has this vision in chapter 37, just kind of skipping over some of the other territory there. He's got this vision of the valley of dry bones, the valley of dry bones. And he sees in this vision all these bones strewn about the land. And then the bones come together and they form people and they get sinews and muscle and skin. And then it's ranks of people he sees. This is just a vision. This isn't real. It's a vision that he sees. But it's a vision for Ezekiel that after all this captivity stuff is done, there's a day coming when Israel will be reborn. The rebirth of the nation is seen in Ezekiel 37 with the dry bones coming together. God's going to do something with Israel after the captivity. And then in Ezekiel 40 to 48, you'd have to read this to really fully get a grip on what's going on here. But the way it's best described is in Ezekiel 40 to 43 is the millennial temple. You can Google this. You can just Google image, what is Ezekiel's millennial temple? And you will see a massive building, 1 mile square at the base, with some of the doorways that are 100 feet high. I mean, it's such an exact building plan for a temple that's coming in the future that we can reproduce exactly what it's going to look like. Like there's 90 rooms all the way around it, 3 stories high, 30 rooms on each side. It's like at least 90 rooms all the way around this temple. And this is a temple that's going to be on earth after Messiah comes. There will be worship going on in a temple during the millennial kingdom on earth. And then in the last chapters of Ezekiel, like 44 and following, it's the millennial lands. And it shows how all the 12 tribes of Israel will be there. Now, if I could show you a map of where the tribes were when Joshua conquered the land, way back in 1400 BC, you would see Gashur and Reuben and Gad, and you'd see all the tribes, Issachar, in different places. But in this geographic arrangement, you can Google this too. What's the millennial tribal arrangement? You'll see the picture of it there. And it has the Jews horizontally, Judah, Gad, Nathan, all these different prophets. It's horizontal. It's a different tribal arrangement, but it's in the Holy Land. And then in the center of it is the place for that great mile square millennial temple. And so this isn't the regathering after Babylon. Zerubbabel built a temple after, in 536 BC, but that temple wasn't anything like this one. The Jews repatriated the land after the Babylonian captivity, but this isn't the same thing. This is a different story. And if we believe the Bible literally, plainly, normally, historically, grammatically, and all that like we do, then this has to still be coming. And it fits. It just fits with that 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. So that's why I call Ezekiel, he's the prophet who saw the millennium all the way to the end of time. Okay, now we're going to talk about Daniel a little bit here, and the difficulty is to keep a little bit on Daniel because this is a guy who went from the lion's den to the Lord's day. Daniel was thrown in the lion's den, but he also had all these prophecies about the coming of the Lord. But I'd have to say that the subject of Daniel is the promise of restoration for Israel. Daniel's in the Babylonian captivity. He was taken captive in, let's say, maybe 605 BC, and then he lived all the way to 536. He's 85 years old by the time the captivity ended. So he didn't go back with Ezra and Zerubbabel to rebuild. He was too old. He just stayed in Babylon, but he had all these prophecies there. And this promise of restoration unfolds through the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar and then the prophecies of Daniel. Some interesting literary point about Daniel. It's written in 2 languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. The Hebrew part is chapter 1 and chapters 8 to the end. The Aramaic part is chapters 2 through 7. And chapters 2 through 7 really chronicles and sets forth what's going on in the Gentile world between the time of Daniel all the way to the end when Jesus comes, okay? And that's Gentile world truth. And the rest of it has mostly to do with the Hebrews and the Jewish people. A little bit about Daniel. What's going on in Daniel? In chapter 1, the boys are taken captive. They're told to eat the king's food. They said, no, we're going to eat our Jewish food. And they were tested, and they came out after 10 days looking better than those Babylonians. So the Jewish food was better. Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a heavy metal man, this big, huge image with a head of gold and a bronze belly and silver shoulders and iron legs. And all of these pointed out prophetically that there's going to be Babylon and then Medo-Persia and then the Greek world and then the Roman Empire, predicting all these great empires as it's stated in that dream of that heavy metal man in Daniel 2. Well, Nebi has a dream about this huge statue. In chapter 3, he builds a huge statue. Wonder where he got the idea from his dream. He builds a 90-foot statue to himself and then tries to force all these people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to bow down and worship. Well, they didn't bow down and worship, so they were thrown into the fiery furnace and rescued from that. There's some common factors that always interest me in chapters 1, 3, and 6. In chapter 1, there's a dilemma, the boys and the diet. Chapter 3, there's a dilemma, the boys and the fiery furnace. In chapter 6, there's a dilemma. That's Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. But in chapters 1, 3, and 6, these Jewish young people are confronted. They have a threat. They make a resolution of faith. There's a period of testing. 10 days with the Jewish food, chapter 1. Thrown into the fiery furnace, chapter 3. Thrown into the lion's den, chapter 6. There's a successful outcome. Nobody dies. And the result is the king, the Babylonian or Persian king, praises God. And there's a lesson there. Your testimony, class, impresses others. The way you live. You might not even realize that people are watching you in that store, or watching you how you drive, or watching you when you're strolling with your girlfriend or your boyfriend through the park. But they might, I think that guy's a Christian, and I'm going to watch how he lives. And I'm impressed with how that person lives. Your testimony impresses others. Well, there's a great prophecy here in Daniel. Daniel 9, 24 to 27. I'll spend the last minutes of this brief video piece talking about these 4 verses. I don't know if there's any more profound verses other than Genesis 12, 1 to 3. And now Daniel 9, 24 to 27. This is the famous 70 weeks prophecy, where Daniel finds out that there's going to be 70 weeks of years, or 490 years left for the Gentiles to stomp all over these Jews. And at the end of those 490 years, it's done. And Messiah is going to be here, and the kingdom will be set up on earth. And so it says in Daniel 9:24, I encourage you to grab a Bible and follow me here. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. And that's 70 weeks. He's been thinking in terms of years in this chapter, so that would be 70 times 7, which is 490 years. And there's 6 things described in verse 24 that are going to be completed during this 490-year period. I mean, he's saying it's 490 years. It's amazing. But verse 25, here's where we get into the intrigue. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, that's 445 BC, Nehemiah's decree, you can go back and rebuild those walls. Remember, we talked about those walls. 445 BC, until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is 69 weeks of years. Now, I'll just do the math here, okay? Trust me on this. 445 BC, 483 years later, you've got AD 33. And that's when Jesus was crucified. It says after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. That's verse 26. That's the death of Messiah. Class, we've been talking in this course about these prophets, predicting the coming of Jesus, his suffering, and, please the Lord to bruise him, Isaiah 53, things like this. Well, here Messiah's going to be cut off. He's going to be killed after 483 years. You do the math, and his death is AD 33. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city. Well, AD 33 was the death of Jesus. AD 70 was when Rome was destroyed. This is predicting the destruction of Rome, the burning of Rome, which happened in AD 70. And an end will come with wars. Desolations are determined. Now, verse 27, this is the one that has a lot of people talking and writing papers and books. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. In other words, after an undisclosed interregnum, an intertestamental, not intertestamental, but an interim time period between the 69th week and now the 70th week, the final week of this prophecy. We don't know how long that period is, but I'm suggesting it's been at least 2,000 years now since Jesus was crucified, almost 2,000 years. But once that whole period's done, it says there will be a final week, a 7-year period. This is why we talk about the tribulation. The 7-year tribulation. That's what verse 27 is talking about, I believe. He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay, what's that saying? Well, it's saying there's going to be a single person. We know him as the Antichrist. The Bible talks about the man of sin, the man of lawlessness. The Antichrist is going to come. He's going to make a covenant with the many for 1 week. He's going to sign a treaty with Israel and allow Israel to start sacrificing again. He's going to look like the great protector of the Jews. He's going to be Reverend Wonderful to the Jews during that 1 week period. But then halfway through the week, he's going to tear up that covenant like a worthless piece of paper. He's going to put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and then it's going to get worse. And friends, this is confirmed by what Jesus teaches in Matthew 24 and 25 about the coming of the man of sin. It's taught in First Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 talks about this man of lawlessness is revealed and all the terror he's going to bring on the earth. So this is the Antichrist described here. So after this interregnum period, I call it the church age, once the church age is done, fullness of the Gentiles has come in and all that, then we're going to have this Antichrist is going to arise, and he's going to wreak havoc for 7 years on the world. Book of Revelation, chapters 6 through 18, that's most of Revelation is talking about this 7-year tribulation period. So that's a big deal. It's an amazing prophecy because it really it points up what's going to happen up to the time of Jesus, and is telling us that there's still a pretty wicked, nasty 7-year period coming on this earth. But we learn a lot from the 70 weeks prophecy. If God has not forgotten us, he's never forgotten Israel. There's people today who think that Israel's done. They rejected Messiah 2,000 years ago. They're done. The church is the new Israel. You know, that's all there is. Well, that just isn't true, because there's numerous prophecies in the Old Testament that have never been fulfilled, and they would naturally await their fulfillment at the second coming of Jesus, in what Revelation 20 calls a 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. So God has not forgotten Israel. He's not forgotten us. Captivity has a purpose. For these Jews to be 70 years in Babylon, that's important. They were captive. They learned some things. When the Jews get out of Babylon in 536, they will never again be idolaters. It's like that captivity purged idolatry. No more Baal and Ashtoreth and Dagon and Ishtar. Okay? Thirdly, discipline brings reformation. You reform, you change. If you go through a hardship, if you go through a time of captivity where you're just not sure and you're struggling, you're going, why does it have to be so hard? I tell you what, friends, there's a purpose for it. James 1 talks about that. When you have trials, consider your trials. Be joyful in trials. Why? Because the testing of your faith produces endurance, and endurance brings a perfect result. It brings you to a perfect end. And that's how it's going to end with Israel after this 490-year period. That brings to an end our study of the major prophets.